A conversation with a neighbor needs our attention. Please kindly stay silent and listen bit by bit. Courtrooms are built to hold testimony, evidence, and procedure. But when the hearings end and the doors close, the story often continues in the voices of neighbors, friends, and quiet observers. In the case of Emmanuel Haro, that truth lingers just outside the courthouse steps. One neighbor remembers more than just ordinary routines. They recall movements that felt out of place, evenings when Jake Haro's comings and goings seemed hurried, and a presence that made them pause long before Emmanuel's disappearance was ever reported. At the time, they said nothing, unsure if it was their place to speak or if they were misreading what they saw. But now, with courtroom revelations echoing through the community, their memories carry new weight. This isn't just a story about charges, hearings, or legal documents. It is about how the small details that people notice from across the street can hold answers long before headlines ever appear. But before we dive into this, kindly subscribe to our channel if you believe in fighting for justice. Because every view, every comment, every subscriber is a stand against silence and a step toward justice. We've just crossed 5,000 subscribers, all because of your support, and we need that same energy to reach 6,000, then 7,000, and then 10,000. So go ahead and drop your fingerprints on that subscribe button, and definitely where you're watching from. Because wherever you are, the day this vision is fulfilled, I will send my appreciation straight to you. Let's keep building this community that stands and fights for justice together. The courthouse doors close, but the air outside still carries the weight of what was just heard inside. On the steps, people speak in lowered voices, neighbors exchange cautious glances, and conversations drift between speculation and silence. It is in these moments, away from the judge's gavel and the attorney's arguments, that another side of the story begins to take shape. Among those standing quietly is a neighbor, someone who lived just a few steps away from the Haro household. For months they noticed things that didn't sit right, movements that felt unusual, patterns that left them uneasy. Until now, they've kept their thoughts private. But on this day after court, they finally decide to share what they saw in the days leading up to Emmanuel's disappearance. Because sometimes, the truth is whispered long before it is ever spoken in a courtroom. When the neighbor first began to notice changes in Jake Haro's daily movements, their initial reaction was hesitation. They weren't the kind of person to assume the worst, and they had lived in the community long enough to know that everyone has their own routines, their own stresses, and their own reasons for coming and going at unusual times. But still, something about what they were seeing didn't sit comfortably. It started subtly. The usual rhythm of the household seemed disrupted. Times of departure shifted. Jake would step out when the neighborhood was unusually quiet, almost as if he preferred not to be seen. Sometimes it was late in the evening, other times earlier than expected in the morning. The consistency that most families show, the regular coming and going, was missing. The neighbor described moments when Jake appeared hurried, moving with a tension that didn't match the casual errands most people run. His posture was tight, his steps quick, and on certain days he seemed unusually alert, glancing around more than he had before. These were not dramatic gestures, but in a neighborhood where people grow used to the patterns of daily life, small shifts stand out. At first, the neighbor brushed it off. People can be busy. Life changes, schedules adjust, but the more they observed, the harder it became to explain away. To them, these movements didn't carry the rhythm of ordinary errands. They didn't feel like the quick trips everyone makes to the store, or the predictable drives that neighbors notice without thinking. Instead, there was a sharpness to it all, a sense that Jake's movements carried more weight than a simple routine. Looking back now, the neighbor admits that these details may have been pieces of a larger picture. At the time, though, they remained unspoken, filed away as private suspicions, whispers of unease in an otherwise quiet street. In the week leading up to Emmanuel being reported missing, the neighbor remembers a shift that felt impossible to ignore. What had once been small, passing details began forming into a pattern. Jake was stepping out at hours that felt unusual for the neighborhood's quiet rhythm. Sometimes it was late at night, when most homes had already gone still. Other times it was early in the morning, before the day had fully begun. What struck the neighbor most was not just the timing, but the way Jake seemed to move during those moments. He often avoided eye contact, keeping his head lowered or his attention fixed elsewhere, as if hoping not to draw notice. It wasn't dramatic, but it left the impression of someone who did not want to be observed. There were also occasions when he carried items in and out of the home. To an outside observer, none of it could be proven to hold any deeper meaning: bags, boxes, or objects that could easily have been part of ordinary life. And yet, the way it was done, the hours chosen, the caution in his movements, left the neighbor quietly uneasy. Still, they chose not to speak up. They convinced themselves that it wasn't their place. Maybe they were overthinking. Maybe they were misreading what they saw. And like so many people who hesitate in these situations, they reminded themselves that without proof, it was better to stay silent. Looking back now, the neighbor reflects on that silence with a kind of regret. Communities often carry warnings within them, small signs, little changes, fleeting moments that suggest something is off. But when those signs are ignored, or left unspoken, the opportunity to act can be lost. And in this case, the silence stretched on until Emmanuel's disappearance forced everyone to confront what had been happening all along. When the news first broke that Emmanuel had been reported missing, the neighbor immediately thought back to the unusual movements they had noticed in the days before. And almost instantly, something about the story didn't feel right to them. The timeline that was presented to the public felt off. The way events were described, the day, the time, the location, didn't match what the neighbor had witnessed just outside their own front door. To them, there was a gap between what was being said and what they had quietly observed. In their words, the timeline felt off. The way the story was presented didn't match what I had seen in the days before. And then there was Jake himself. After the report of Emmanuel's disappearance, his demeanor seemed different. The neighbor recalled him appearing more guarded, almost hyper-aware of his surroundings. He seemed to notice who was watching, who was standing outside, and who might be paying attention. Where before his movements had felt hurried and tense, now they carried an added layer of caution, like someone taking care not to leave behind questions. For the neighbor, it was unsettling. On one hand, they carried fear of being wrong, fear of misjudging, fear of stepping into something larger than themselves. On the other hand, there was regret. Regret that they hadn't spoken up sooner, when the first signs had begun to surface. That tension between fear and regret hung heavy in their thoughts. Because by the time Emmanuel's disappearance was making headlines, it was already too late to change what had happened. All the neighbor could do was reflect on the details they had kept to themselves, and wonder what might have been different had those quiet observations been voiced when they first arose. As the courtroom hearings unfolded, the neighbor found themselves listening closely. Piece by piece, testimony and legal arguments began to confirm what they had quietly suspected all along. Timelines that were mentioned by investigators seemed to overlap with what they had witnessed from their own front porch. Dates and times that once felt like private observations now appeared in official records, echoed back in the structured language of the courtroom. For the neighbor, it was both validating and unsettling, proof that what they had noticed was not imagined, but also a reminder of how much had gone unspoken until it was too late. The public story of Emmanuel's abduction, the one first broadcast on the news, began to unravel under the weight of new evidence. And against that unraveling stood the neighbor's memories, late-night movements, hurried departures, and moments of avoidance that had seemed so strange at the time. It was as if the quiet observations of a single household were now being pieced together with the official account of investigators. But what struck the neighbor most was the contrast. To sit in court and watch Rebecca and Jake Haro facing legal proceedings was one reality. To recall seeing them outside their home, living day to day in the same neighborhood, was another. The difference between those two images weighed heavily, a reminder that the line between ordinary life and hidden truth can be razor thin. Reflecting on this, the neighbor offered a simple but powerful thought. Sometimes what you see from across the street tells a story that the courts take months to uncover. And in those words was the heart of the matter: how silence, hesitation, and unspoken suspicion can live quietly in a community until the law finally gives them a voice. The neighbor's story is not just about one household or one case, it points to something larger. Communities often notice the small things. A shift in routine, a change in tone, movements that don't quite fit the pattern. These red flags are often seen, but rarely spoken aloud. Not because people don't care, but because they hesitate. They question themselves. They wonder if it's their place, or if they might be reading too much into something ordinary. Yet, investigations are built on more than just documents and courtroom testimony. They depend on courage, on the willingness of those who see and notice to step forward, even when they are unsure. Each detail, no matter how small it may seem at the time, can become part of a larger truth. The neighbor's perspective shows how valuable these observations can be. From across the street, they noticed patterns that would later echo in legal records. What once felt like private unease has now become part of a much bigger story. And it serves as a reminder: silence can delay answers, but observation has the power to bring them closer. In the end, the neighbor's account is more than just a personal memory. It becomes a reminder that truth often lives in plain sight. Long before the courtroom arguments, long before the headlines, there were small details noticed from across the street. Movements that didn't fit, patterns that raised questions, and silence that held back words. The Emmanuel Haro case is not only about legal proceedings or testimony. It is also about the echoes of what people saw, what they suspected, and what they chose to keep to themselves. Those quiet observations, now shared, add another layer to the story, a layer that shows how communities are often closer to the truth than they realize. And so the question becomes not just about what happened in this case, but about what happens next time. What would you do if you noticed something that didn't feel right? Would you speak up, even at the risk of being wrong, or would you wait, hoping the headlines will confirm what you already feared? In stories like this, the difference between silence and speaking out can shape everything. And that is why every observation matters, because the truth, no matter how delayed, always leaves a trail.